Hello, my name is Bets Peters, and I'm presenting today with Michelle Kinsella and Melanie Friedoken. I'm going to talk with you about brain-computer interface as an AAC access method. Michelle is going to tell you about our research study that is open to new participants right now, and a couple of other studies from other groups that your clients might find interesting. And then Melanie is going to be there live at the symposium to answer any questions that you might have about BCI or anything else we're going to talk about today. A little bit more about us. All three of us are researchers with the Renew Lab at OHSU, which is run by Melanie. We're also part of the Consortium for Accessible Multimodal Brain-Body Interfaces, or CAMBI, which I will tell you a little bit more about in a moment. And we're also clinicians. Melanie and I are both SLPs and AAC specialists. I used to actually work as the Assistive Technology Coordinator for the local chapter of the ALS Association, now ALS Northwest, and also at the Portland VA. And Melanie did clinical work in AAC for many years at the Center for Voice and Swallowing at OHSU. Michelle is an OT and specializes in vision impairment, which is particularly important for our work since our BCI systems use visual interfaces, and many people who are potential BCI users may have vision impairments. A little bit more about CAMBI. This is a research group with a focus on interdisciplinary collaboration. So here at OHSU, we have the clinical team, which is us who are presenting to you today. We also work with a team in the neurology department who are experts in brain signal acquisition, so actually getting the EEG data that can be used to control our BCI systems. We also have an in-house software development team that writes our code, and we work closely with potential BCI users, so people with disabilities who might eventually benefit from this technology. We follow a participatory action research model. We want to get those folks involved in all stages of the research process as early as possible. We also work with an electrical and computer engineering team at Northeastern University in Boston, as well as a natural language processing team at Michigan Tech, and we have an experimental design expert at UW. So our agenda for today, we're going to talk about how BCI actually works as an AAC access method, the different types of hardware and control signals that can be used, and some video demonstrations of these systems actually in action. We're going to talk about who might potentially benefit as users of BCI technology, and then some of the practical issues that go along with that. So, a brief introduction to BCI. Most of you will be familiar with some of the access methods that are available for AAC and other computer-based devices. Obviously, if someone has good hand function, they can use typical access methods like a touch screen or a mouse and keyboard, or possibly something like an adapted wheelchair joystick or a trackball. If someone has good eye movement, they can use eye tracking with their AAC device. We also have head control. Someone might be able to use their foot to control a large trackball or activate a switch. And we even have switches that can work with small muscle movements like the twitch of an eyebrow or a cheek. But those all require movement. What happens with somebody with very severe disabilities who really has no voluntary motor function? Or perhaps they're able to move sometimes, but if they are fatigued or due to the effects of medication or for other reasons, that movement is not always reliable. How can we help someone control a computer, including speech-generating devices, just with brain activity? This is where BCI comes in. It's a way to control a computer without any muscle activity at all, and a way to interact with the environment just using brain signals. It has applications, of course, for AAC and communication, also for things like computer access, controlling a power wheelchair or robotic arm, environmental controls. Really anything that you can do with a computer can be controlled by BCI, in theory at least. So how does this actually work? How do we go from someone having the intention to produce a message and communicate with others how they're thinking hello, how do we get to actually producing that message? BCI systems are often portrayed in the media as mind-reading machines. I want you to know this is absolutely not the case. They are not reading your mind. They are purely recording electrical activity, and the user is in complete control of the system. It's not as simple as the user thinks of what they want to say, and that is somehow automatically turned into synthesized speech or a typed message. The user is controlling a computer. They're sending a command to a computer, almost as if they're using a switch with scanning. It works kind of similarly. You'll see in some examples later of how these systems work, but the computer is presenting options and the person is responding. They're just responding with their brain activity rather than with a physical movement. This gets a little bit more complicated with some of the implantable systems, but regardless of how the system works, the user is in control of how their brain activity is fed into the computer and what it does. It's not like the device is going to read their mind and tell everyone all of their most secret thoughts without them being in control of that. The user is in control. So let's talk about some of the BCI systems that have been developed. There are two broad categories, non-implantable or wearable devices. You can see on the left an example of someone, this is my dad actually, wearing an EEG cap with those electrodes held against the scalp. And the other category is implantable, where there is actually a device either on the surface of the brain or sort of a probe into the brain tissue that can acquire those signals right from the brain directly. And we're going to talk about some examples of each of these. So we'll start first with the non-implantable systems. Most non-implantable BCI systems are based on electroencephalography, or EEG. It can also be done with fMRI, FNIRS, or magnetoencephalography, but those you need a very specialized equipment. It's not portable. EEG is easier to use, easier to transport, somewhat less expensive, although it is still quite expensive. So let's talk a little bit more about EEG, the most commonly used method of data acquisition for non-implantable BCIs. So EEG requires electrodes placed on the scalp. You can see in the photo my dad wearing a cap, kind of like a swim cap that has those electrodes embedded in it. There are also systems that have more like a helmet type setup or a headband or other ways of holding those electrodes. You'll see a couple more photos in just a moment. And those electrodes record electrical activity in the brain cells, but because they have to record that activity through several layers of tissue, so you've got through the skull, through the scalp, through hair, they have a really poor signal to noise ratio. It's kind of like listening to somebody talk through a heavy wood door as opposed to just being in the same room with them. There are a couple of different types of EEG electrodes. These are wet electrodes. The ones on the right are sort of cup-shaped with a little opening that would be filled with a conductive gel. Not all of them are cup-shaped, but most of them do have a hole in it where you would use a blunt-tip syringe, like you see in the photo, to insert a little bit of conductive gel. That fills in the gaps between the electrode and the scalp. Typically there's some hair or some other space there. So the gel just makes sure that there's an actual connection between the skin and the metal of the electrode. There are some definite downsides to using wet electrodes, mostly just that you get gel in your hair. Some people find it uncomfortable. Most people don't mind too much, but it's sort of hard to remove without shampooing. And if you're a person with severe disabilities, you may not wash your hair every day. So this is definitely a practical concern. We also have dry electrodes, which you can see here on the bottom. That's a pretty typical design where there are those little pins that kind of work their way through the hair to make contact with the skin. In the pictures up top, you can see an example of a cap that uses dry electrodes, and that's how they're held in that little helmet to press against the skin. On the back of the electrodes, you can see in the photo on the right, there's a little hole in the middle of that electrode. You can insert a tool in there and kind of rotate the electrode, and that sort of works it through the hair and makes sure that there's good contact. So dry electrodes obviously have the advantage of not needing gel, so they're a little bit faster to apply and set up, and they don't require washing of the hair to get rid of any gel. The signal to noise ratio is not quite as good, at least with some dry electrode systems. The signals can be a little bit messier, and some people find them uncomfortable depending on the design of the helmet or the cap. Most of them are sort of spring-loaded, so they should be fairly comfortable as long as the cap fits well, but it is a little bit harder to find a good fit with dry electrodes. Now let's talk a little bit about how EEG is actually used for computer control. There are a few common types of brain signals that can be used for control, and I'm going to talk about 3 of them: the P300 event-related potential, the steady-state visual evoked potential, and motor imagery. So the event-related potential, often called the P300 event-related potential, is a brain response to an infrequent or novel stimulus. So if you're looking at a series of pictures and you see potato, 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 parakeet, when you see the parakeet, that's something new and different, and your brain is going to have a little response to that, like, oh, that's different, something changed. And it looks a little bit like this. This plot just shows an example of brain activity after a stimulus is presented. So time is on the x-axis below. The red line represents that boring, constant stimulus, something the brain doesn't really care about. You can see there's not a lot of change in that signal. The green line is when you introduce that novel stimulus, something that is a little bit surprising or that the person is attending to more. And you can see that spike in the green signal. It happens around 300 milliseconds in most people. That's why it's often called the P300 ERP. It's a positive change in voltage after about 300 milliseconds. And the computer can actually pick up the difference between responses to non-target or non-attended stimuli, like the potato, and novel or interesting or attended stimuli, like the parakeet. And we can use that for letter selection. If somebody is looking at a stream of letters instead of a stream of pictures, and let's say they're looking for the letter A, then they have a different response when the A appears compared to other letters that aren't the one that they're looking for. They're attending to the A and they're watching those letters, don't care, don't care, don't care. Ooh, there's the A. We use this in our system called the RSVP keyboard, developed by Canby with input from our research team members with disabilities. And I'm going to give you a chance to see what that looks like right now. So this is our typing interface. You can see at the top there's a target phrase, go to the store. Part of the phrase has already been typed. So the user in this example is going to be looking for the letter S to start typing store. So when I click forward, you're going to see a fixation cross. That just sort of means get ready and look in that area of the screen. And then you're going to see a stream of flashing letters. So I want you to look for the S in that stream of letters. Here we go. So if you were actually wearing the cap and hooked up to the computer, you would have seen the S and had that event-related potential spike in your brain signal. The computer would have picked that up, noticed that your response to the S was different from your response to the other letters, and selected the letter S for typing. The event-related potential can also be used to control an interface called the matrix speller. This is quite commonly used in the BCI literature. It was actually the first communication BCI design that was developed and tested. You can see in the video the letters are arranged in a grid, and rows and columns are flashing quickly one by one. So the way you would use this is look at the letter that you want to select, So here, the next letter is R in the word free. You would look at the R on the screen and just keep your eyes fixed on it. And every time the R flashed as part of either a row or a column, you would have that P300 response. The computer would average your responses to a few different flashes in a row to get enough evidence to know that you were looking at the R and that that was your intended character. The steady state visual evoked potential, or SSVEP, is another brain signal that can be acquired with EEG. It's a response to a flashing or oscillating visual stimulus measured over the visual cortex, so the electrodes are going to be placed at the back of the head. And the frequency of the brain response that's measured there is related to the frequency of the stimulus presentation. So, for example, if there are 3 targets on the screen, they could be flashing at different rates. So we might have one target that's flashing at 4 times per second, one 6 times per second, and one 8 times per second. If you're looking at the target that's flashing 4 times per second, your brain response is going to happen along with that frequency at about 4 times per second, 4 waves per second. If you're looking at the faster flashing, the 8 times per second, you're going to have a faster rhythm to your brain response. So the computer can actually tell the difference between which stimulus you're focusing on based on the frequency of your brain response. And we can associate that with letters or words or other targets on the screen. So if the letter A was in a box that was flashing at 4 times per second and the letter C is in a box that's flashing at 8 times per second, the computer would be able to tell whether you were attending to the A or the C based on the frequency of your brain response. We developed a system called the Shuffle Speller that can be used with SSVEP. And this was the hardware setup. We just had a little headband that held 3 electrodes at the back of the head. For typing with SSVEP, we designed this system called the Shuffle Speller. You can see here there are 4 little panels of LEDs at the top, bottom, left, and right of the interface here. All 4 of those are going to flash at different rates. It's a little bit hard to see in the video here, but the top one is going the slowest, the bottom one is going the fastest, and the 2 on the sides are kind of in between. The goal here would be to type the word apple, so we're going to be looking for the letter A first. When I start the video, you'll see 4 boxes appear on the screen, and you'll see the letters in the middle. I want you to look at the letter A, find it in the grid here. It is orange. That means it's going to move to that orange box on the left, and the user would look at that light flashing next to the orange box to say, I want one of the letters in that box. Now the computer's trying to get more information about the letters that were in that box. It moves the A to a box by itself, so you can just look at that bottom flashing light, and that gives enough information to type. Now we're looking for P, which has gone to the yellow box. We would look at that light. The computer's going to ask you again, okay, which letter in that box? Something in the orange box. Okay, we're going to get a little bit more information. It's back in the yellow box. And now the cumulative evidence of those 3 decisions from looking at those 3 boxes adds up to selection of P. Here our language model has determined that P is very likely to come next, so it puts it in its own box, makes it easy to select. Now L is very likely. By looking at the bottom light, you can select L. So that kind of gives you an idea of how the SSVEP works. You can design different interfaces that work with this same signal. So you could, for example, have a grid display with different phrases or symbols, other things like that that could be associated with different flashing frequencies, and make selections just by focusing on attending to one of those flashing stimuli on the screen. Motor imagery is another type of brain signal that can be acquired with EEG, and it involves imagining different movements to produce different patterns of brain activity. So the 2 diagrams here show different patterns of brain activity on the head from 2 different imagined movements. So for example, you could have someone imagine moving their hand, imagine squeezing their hand to equal yes, or you can imagine wiggling your toes to say no. You can associate those different motor patterns with different meanings. They could also be associated with, for example, a scanning paradigm. You could imagine squeezing your hand to advance the cursor, and you could imagine wiggling your toes to make a selection of an item on that grid. Now I'd like to talk about implantable AAC BCI systems. There are three primary types of data acquisition for implantable BCIs. There's electrocorticography, which involves electrodes that are just placed on the surface of the brain. Intracortical microelectrode arrays involve a grid of teeny tiny needles that actually penetrate into the cortex. And finally, there are endovascular electrode arrays that are inserted in a blood vessel within the brain. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples of each of these and show what they look like. This is an example of a microelectrode array used by the BrainGate group, which is one of the major implantable BCI research groups. In the upper right, you can see what the grid looks like. You can see those tiny little needles that penetrate into the surface of the brain. It's quite small. In the upper left, you can see the little triangle arrow pointing to that grid, the black square on the surface of a penny. You can see how small it is compared to the penny. And in the bottom left, you can see where it might be placed on the brain and how small it is in compared to the whole brain. Also in the upper left, you can see what's called the pedestal, which is a part that actually sticks out of the person's head that is connected by a wire to the microelectrode array. You can see that in the bottom right, there's an arrow pointing to the top of that participant's head, showing where the pedestal actually comes out. Here's a closer look at that. There are wireless implantable BCIs now, but some of them are still wired. So you can see, that does have some disadvantages as well, on top of the need for surgery, which inherently has risks and, of course, costs associated with it. There is, for some of these systems, a portion of the hardware that protrudes through the scalp, which obviously you have to take care of. There is a slight risk of infection, but there are also people who've had these systems implanted who've had them for years without any major problems. So because intracortical arrays like the one used in BrainGate are acquiring signals directly from the brain tissue, they don't have to go through the layers of bone and skin and hair that can degrade the signal. You can get a really strong signal from them, and there's a lot that you can do with that as far as computer control and communication. So I've included some links to some really interesting papers by groups that are working in this area. One application for implantable BCI is control of a cursor for point and click. So in this paper, they follow a couple of people who've had these electrodes implanted. There are videos along with the article that show individuals using this device to control a pointer and click items on the screen, and they can use it to type into AAC software to do other things navigating on the computer. So that's pretty interesting to check out. Another application is imagined handwriting. So this group actually had their users imagine moving their hands to write letters. So the electrode was placed over the motor cortex, and it could recognize different patterns for when they attempted or imagined to write different letters, and people were actually able to type quite quickly that way. So here is a link to an article about that. And it's also possible with these intracortical arrays to actually decode attempted speech. So this is the closest thing that anyone has come so far to just being able to think about something and have it spoken aloud. It's still not quite that simple. It's not the same as, those of us who are speaking being able to produce words that way, but the users can imagine or attempt to speak different words, and the computer can decode the motor activity that's detected from that attempted speech to identify words and phrases. Right now, this has been done to quite high accuracy, but with a restricted vocabulary. So if the computer knows what the possibilities are for what you might want to say and kind of narrows those down, and you're saying things that are within that vocabulary, it is actually able to decode pretty accurately and pretty quickly. So the videos of this technology are pretty interesting. I would recommend checking that out. So there's going to be a lot of advances in implanted BCI in the coming years. I'm really excited to see what comes of that. Another type of implantable BCI is the stentrode. So this time, instead of doing a craniotomy and implanting electrodes actually into the surface of the cortex, this is a stent type device that can be inserted intravenously. Typically, the incision is made in the groin area, and they feed the stentrode all the way up through the blood vessels into the brain, into the motor cortex area. Here's a close-up of that. You can see that the stentrode is kind of a mesh tube that has the electrodes embedded in it, and once it's expanded against the walls of the blood vessel, it can get brain activity from the neurons that are on the other side of the walls of that blood vessel. That is then wired to an internal device. They show it here kind of in the chest area, where you can place the receiver that would actually connect to the computer and send those signals to the computer. Now, the stentrode, at least at this point, does not have quite the good signal-to-noise ratio that the fully implanted electrodes have, but they have had some success using it for computer and tablet control, so it's more of a scanning type control or possibly a point-and-click type control at this point. But the advantage being it is a less invasive, hopefully less risky surgery. Now, the stentrode is from a company called Synchron. They are starting clinical trials to try to get this device approved by the FDA. So if you have any clients who are interested in whether they could potentially be a candidate for one of the early versions of these BCI systems, Synchron would be a good place to check out. They have a registry for both potential users and healthcare professionals who are interested in the technology and just want to be kept in the loop and learn about possible study participation opportunities. If you're interested in that, you can check out this QR code or at synchronbci.com. It's possible that OHSU will become a site for their study. Kind of just depends on where there is patient interest in the device. So if there are enough people who show interest in the Portland area, it's possible we may be able to offer participation in that trial at OHSU. All right, so we've talked a lot about what BCI is and how it works. I want to talk now about the people who could potentially benefit from it. So now, the focus of BCI research for people with disabilities have been primarily people who are not well served by existing access methods. These include folks with locked-in syndrome that can result from a variety of diagnoses. There are a few different levels of locked-in syndrome. People with total LAS have no voluntary movement whatsoever. These folks are obviously not able to use any existing access methods. They're not able to move their eyes for eye control or twitch a muscle for an EMG switch. They're not even able to give signals to a communication partner for partner-assisted scanning or to indicate yes or no. But they do have control over their brain signals. So we want to be able to take advantage of what they are able to do and turn that into a communication access method. Others with the classic form of locked-in syndrome, that means preserved eye movement but no other voluntary movement. Some of those folks may be able to use eye tracking, but some may not. The eye movement may be very restricted, may not have the range or the fixation ability to use eye tracking appropriately. incomplete locked-in syndrome, folks with that level of the condition have some other voluntary movement in addition to eye movement, and that could mean being able to activate a switch, something like that. But even those with the classic or incomplete LAS forms may benefit from BCI sometimes. Perhaps they're able to use another access method some of the time, but when they're particularly fatigued or under the influence of certain medications, they may not be able to voluntarily reliably move in order to control their device. So BCI could be a good kind of supplementary or backup access method for those folks. And of course, people who are looking at implantable systems would need to be a good candidate for surgery. In the future, it's possible that the user populations could expand. There are certainly companies that are looking at BCIs for people without disabilities, being able to enhance cognition and things like that. So this is really still a very early stages of seeing where this technology is going to go. As far as the diagnoses of people who might benefit from BCI technology, our group did a systematic review of research that involved BCI-based AACs used by people with disabilities, and this is the breakdown of the diagnoses that were investigated in those papers. So ALS was a big one. About 70% of the studies that we looked at included people with ALS. So getting to the later stages of the disease when voluntary motor function is very reduced, BCI may be an option for folks. People who've had strokes, who don't have disorders of consciousness, that was the next largest group, followed by muscular dystrophy, spinal cord injury, and cerebral palsy. Other diagnoses that were represented, other forms of motor neuron disease, progressive ataxia, disorders of consciousness, MS, traumatic brain injury, and a variety of other conditions. There has been some research on BCI systems for children. Most of the research out there is on adults, but there have been some investigation of systems for typing, for communication via selection of icons, so using other symbol sets besides just the alphabet, for games and for painting. The BCI CAN network in Canada is one of the big groups working in this area, and they have begun a clinical BCI program. You can check out their BCI for Kids account on Twitter. They post artwork that has been made by the kids in their program, as well as other news about what's going on with them. It's really a great program, definitely worth checking out. Now let's talk about some of the practical issues for BCI as an AAC access method. So things like limited availability, the expense, performance limitations, being able to adapt it to user characteristics and needs, noise and artifacts, discomfort, the risks associated with implantable systems, and caregiver burden. Let's talk a little bit more about each of those. So most BCI systems really are still in the research and beta testing phase. There are few, if any, options available for home use. Current EEG hardware prices range from $500 for a very, very basic, low-quality system to tens of thousands of dollars. The software is primarily open source with little to no tech support available. So there are no established assistive technology companies who are selling BCI yet. And insurance coverage is still very much up in the air. I have heard of a couple of cases of BCI systems being funded through the VA. That is so far the only funding source I have heard of that's covered BCI. So just pure availability of the hardware, support, and the cost are huge barriers at this time. The performance of BCIs for AAC is pretty poorly described in the literature. There are high error rates for some users with disabilities. Some people seem to do really well. There isn't a whole lot of information about why. Why some people who have the same diagnosis and similar level of disability would do well with the system and some would not. Typing rates are typically quite slow, especially for the non-implantable systems. But we do know that different systems may work better for different users. So early on in the BCI field, there was this concept called BCI illiteracy, the idea being that some people just can't use a BCI. That turns out to be not true. There are several studies where they have compared two different BCI systems or different configurations of the same system, and turns out that some folks who have really poor performance with one system do well with a different system that might use a different interface or a different brain signal. So BCIs don't work well for everybody, but we're working on making systems that are more adaptable and customizable and hoping to make them work better for more people. Hopefully that's something that's going to keep improving. BCI system performance can be affected by things like fatigue, attention, medication, the sensory skills that are needed for the user interface. Most interfaces these days are visual interfaces, so if you have visual impairments, that can be a problem. So again, systems should be customizable to suit user needs and preferences. Noise and artifacts can be a problem with the BCI control signal. This is especially true for the non-implantable systems. This can be caused by muscle activity, so that's things like eye movements and blinks, as well as spasticity, unintended movements. Electrical interference from other medical equipment like ventilators can be a problem, potentially from other electronic equipment in the room. That has gotten better. Most modern hardware has ways of dealing with that, but it can still be an issue. And it is really important to have the electrodes applied properly. If they're loose or worn out or just not placed correctly, you may not get good results. And discomfort. Some folks get headache or eye strain from looking at the computer screen for so long, or from wearing the cap. Certain caps can cause skin irritation or breakdown for folks who are prone to that. And of course, the wet electrodes leave gel in your hair. And for the implantable systems, there are, of course, additional risks, just the risk associated with surgery or anesthesia, inflammation and scar tissue that can form around the implanted electrodes, the durability over the years, possible need for replacement, not to mention continued support for that technology years down the line. Is the company still going to be there supporting their technology? As well as things like skin erosion or abnormal bone growth. These are all things that researchers are working to deal with, but potential risks of implantable systems. And finally, caregiver burden is a big one to think about. These systems do require setup and adjustment for the electrodes. You have to ensure that the signal quality is good enough for control. Troubleshooting may be an issue, and just the cleaning and maintenance of the hardware that's involved. So it does kind of add a lot to the work of the caregiver. That's again something that researchers and hardware developers are working to make that a little better. So I hope this has been some helpful background about how BCI technology works and what some of the potential uses and benefits, as well as what some of the barriers and drawbacks are. Now I'm going to introduce Michelle Kinsella, who is going to tell you a little bit about BCI research participation opportunities, both within our lab and with other groups.
Hi, this is Michelle from the Renew Lab, and I'd like to tell you about a study that we are currently recruiting for, optimizing the brain-computer interface functional implementation toolkit, or BCI FIT for short. The purpose of the study is to test new features of the BCI FIT to customize the technology for each individualized user, depending upon their physical, visual, or cognitive needs. We also would like to get user feedback to improve the future design for people with disabilities. We will ask participants to agree to participating in up to 24 home visits, each lasting about 3 hours, and for each visit they will receive a $25 gift card. We will ask them to wear an electrode cap, which is much like a swim cap, that will measure their brain waves, which will allow them to type. And lastly, we'll ask them to share what they think of the system to help us improve the future design. We're looking for participants who meet the following criteria. They are a person with ALS between the ages of 18 to 89. They are able to see words on a computer screen, able to read and communicate in English, have dysarthria or currently using AAC or the equivalent of a speech score on the ALS FRS of between 0 and 2. And lastly, that they experience some changes in how they use a computer. So their function would be consistent with the ALS FRS extension scoring on the computer use indicators between 0 and 2. So if you have more questions, or you have some patients that you think would be interested in participating, please contact Michelle at renew@ohsu.edu or 503-494-2732. Thank you.